Let's talk.
Charles Brown.
Killing Maradona, how cocaine, the Camorra, cartels and crime corrupted football's greatest talent is the new book by friend of the show, I think we can call him now, David Arrowsmith. Delighted to say that he doesn't join me from some back street in Napoli, but he's very much live on this. David, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning, Giles. Good morning to everybody. A very European, hot, Mediterranean, sunny morning here in Hove in Sussex on the south coast of the UK. But welcome. Good morning to everybody in Europe. Looking forward to talking to you.
And for those who haven't come across your path before, as you're sitting there in Hove, actually, what's your background? Give me the David 101.
Yes, 20 years in factual television, in documentaries. Left that career behind in 2023 to write my first non-fiction book, which I spoke to you about on the show a couple of years ago, which was called Narco Ball, Love, Death and Football in Escobar's Colombia, which was a sort of love letter to the dark and turbulent history and footballing history of my motherland. I'm half Colombian and half British, grew up in London. And yes, worked for a long time in documentaries, got the chance to write a book about Colombian football and the cartels in the 80s and 90s. And that has now turned into a full-time career.
And I hate to point to the bleeding obvious, but obviously we're going to say, we're talking about cartels in Colombia, and one of the national products that seems to be shipped out of that wonderfully beautiful country. There's a little bit of this involved with Maradona's rise and fall. And I mean, you can, are we looking here? Because obviously, if you're an English football fan, he is pretty close to Satan. But if you're looking here from a tragedy point of view, you can say, if you look at pictures of the young Maradona and then what came to pass, you can look at it as a tragedy, can't you, David?
You absolutely. I think as I developed the idea and researched and wrote the book, I very much came to see him as that kind of Shakespearean tragic character. His arc is sort of written in the stars and foretold, really. And it's an incredibly dramatic story. And I kind of came at it from several starting points, really. Like you say, you know, he's a bit of a boogeyman, really, for British, well, certainly for English football fans, not for Scottish football fans who love him. But I mean, I grew up in England. I was born in 79, and the first World Cup I remember watching was 86 in Mexico. And I watched that as an England fan, and I watched that game with the hand of God and the goal of the century. And I grew up in England with the tabloid press. With the kind of slight, he was playing in Europe and we didn't get a lot of European football then, didn't get to watch, Barcelona and Napoli and Sevilla really over here. And so what you saw of him was him in the World Cups. In our eyes, cheating against England, then, having this quite acrimonious World Cup in Italy in 1990, where he's kind of swearing under his breath at the booze, and loses in the final. Really, not a great final. And then USA 94 with Scream into the Camera, that I think everybody kind of saw as being sort of drug induced, but I think actually genuinely was his anger and frustration and joy and all kinds of other things spilling out. But then sure enough, he did fail a drugs test, not for cocaine, but for ephedrine related substances from a medicinal kind of, bodybuilding related supplement really that he was taking. So we saw him, I think, in this country, in the UK, as a bit of a villain of the piece. And as part of writing the book, I think I discovered a lot more about everything that happened to him throughout his life. Much of it self-inflicted, but an awful amount of it inflicted upon him with and without his understanding. I think, there was a lot of manipulation, a lot of coercion, and a lot of bad decisions by him. And he was a flawed genius, certainly. But I gained a lot more sympathy for him as a human being. And I kind of came to see him as someone who achieved an incredible amount, given everything that he put himself through and everything that he was put through and everything he was used for, really.
I mean, because he didn't spring fully formed as this bogeyman for the English football team. I mean, he was a kid. He did come from Argentina, and Argentina, brilliant country as well. I'd love South America, as you can probably tell, but Argentina in the 60s and the 70s. isn't the sort of place that you want to be. You've got the hangover from Perón, then you've got the junta, you've got, the disappearance. I mean, it's a hellscape, isn't it? So, what is his background, this kid?
Yes. He is absolutely born, into poverty. His father is a manual laborer. Their family have relocated to Buenos Aires from the countryside, but they basically live in this shanty hut that his dad has built with his own bare hands. And Maradona is, I think, the fourth child, the first son of this really quite impoverished family who would often kind of go without food in order to feed their children. With this backdrop, as you say, of the fall of Perón, political and financial turmoil, the rise of the junta, which became this deadly, bloody, violent military dictatorship that led to what was known as the Disappeared, where they rounded up liberal intellectuals, journalists, any opponents of the regime, any proponents of free speech and liberty, really, and tortured them and had them disappeared. Effectively, they were murdered and their bodies disposed of. Thousands of people suffered that fate. And Diego grows up in that backdrop, a poor family in a country, riddled with unemployment, inflation, political repression. And he is able to rise above that and to forge a career as the new great hope of Argentinian football, one of the great global football superstars, and is able to bring himself and his whole family and everybody around him out of relative poverty and into untold riches at the time. So it is a rags to riches story, but it has a very tragic end, a very sad end. And all his chapters really are punctuated by these glorious moments. And then they tend to be bookended by real tragedy, by failing drugs tests, by falling out with managers and leaving clubs under a cloud, by retiring at the worst possible, lowest point in his career. And then his sad death. And even beyond death, his story still rumbles on, is still impossibly complicated, and they're still trying to kind of work out exactly what happened when he died and what is going to happen with whatever is left of what he might be able to pass on to his family.
And the thing is, with South America, this is why Senna in Brazil, with motor racing, he was the people's champion, because, again, Brazil, wonderful country, but economically not doing well. Argentina, Maradona is still revered. My Argentinian friends, a completely different mindset to it. I mean, and if you think that FIFA have got things wrong with giving a World Cup to the States and Mexico and Canada, 78, they give a World Cup to Argentina. It is in the middle of the repression, basically. And, all the Dutch are saying we still should have won that, but that was the one gives us Kempes, Ardiles, Ricky Villa, etc. Is Maradona sort of on the periphery of this? Are people starting to notice him then, and this will give him his rise to Europe eventually? We'll get to Europe, yeah?
Yes. So he is the hot young thing by 78. There's a growing swell to have him picked for the World Cup. The coach of the national team, Menotti, opts not to pick him. He's in the big squad, and then he's cut from the final squad for the tournament. And it's one of the first really big blows to Maradona and his confidence. But he goes back out a few days later. I think he scores 4 goals in his next game, just a few days after getting cut from the national team. He then goes to the 79 Youth World Championships, wins that with Argentina, who are absolutely rampant young Argentina side, is brought back by the regime to Buenos Aires to take the adulation of the crowd for winning that tournament, which conveniently distracts everybody from the Disappeared and everything, all the protests that are going on around that. It's already being used by the regime and by the junta to distract from what they're doing. They're already pegging themselves to him and to football as a really useful way to kind of sports wash their regime. But he is very much, he's very much one that everybody is excited about. It's a bit of a surprise he doesn't get picked in 78. He does force his way, fully into becoming a mainstay of the team. And by 82, he's a key player by the time of the World Cup in Spain.
Who's advising him, by the way, at this point? And when does he go to Europe? Is it straight to Barcelona from Argentina?
Yes. His career is being really handled by a very young man called Jorge Citespieler, who becomes this sort of big brother figure to Diego and some of the other kids when they're playing in the youth team of Argentinos Juniors, Los Cebollitas. And he's just a teenager himself when he takes over looking after Maradona's affairs. He lost a leg to polio. He lost a brother who was aged only in his early 20s, who was a player for Argentinos Juniors. And he becomes this sort of stout helper-outer on the youth team, but is really in a dark place. And then he sees Maradona start to play for this youth team, and it reinvigorates his love for football, his love for life, really. And he starts to guide Maradona, becomes his manager, his business manager, kind of really looks after and guides him in all those affairs. But he's kind of a self-taught, self-made young man, really. And he helps engineer, in the end, this extremely complicated move to Barcelona. The deal is finally done just before the 82 World Cup. And so at the start of the World Cup, Diego has already signed but has yet to appear for Barcelona. He's due to start playing for Barcelona in the autumn of that season. So when he arrives in Spain, he's a world record signed by Barcelona, about to play in his first World Cup as perhaps the star that's being promoted the most for this World Cup. And at the same time, you've got the war going on in the Falkland Islands, Las Malvinas. And then it all kind of goes a bit wrong. He's been led to believe Argentina are winning the war. He's been part of the conscription effort. He's helped raise funds for the war effort. He's been a kind of poster boy for the regime and conscription. He's been told that they're winning. And then the day after the Belgium game in the early stages of the World Cup, the regime announced that they've lost the conflict with the UK, and that kind of the scales fall from his eyes at that point. He realised he's been a bit hoodwinked by the regime and by people back home. And he struggles to come to terms with that. Ozzy Ardiles' cousin is killed in the last few hours of the war. He was a pilot. I think it becomes very, very personal for those young men who were flying the flag for Argentina and being patriotic. They don't have a great World Cup. Maradona doesn't have a great World Cup. And so he starts with Barcelona kind of really with a bit of a cloud over his head, I think, rather than it being this glorious moment of his final arrival in Europe. And sure enough, the Barcelona chapter of his life doesn't go to plan. It's something he tried to brush under the carpet, I think, a bit. And the club, to some extent, decided, they weren't going to dwell on it once it was over. They were quite happy finally when he left.
But in a world, we now live in a world with multi-million pound euro footballers. Maradona goes and joins one of the biggest clubs in the world. And I know it's not how it is today, but it's still Barcelona. There are two teams in Spain. It doesn't matter where you are. You can be in I used to live in a Pueblo Blanco, and they were like, what team do you support? And they were like, no, we're Barcelona, Real Madrid, even though they'd never been further than Malaga. So, he's a young man. He's not an intellectual. He's gifted with a football. They've come from Argentina to Barcelona. They are both young men. It's not like Pelé, who, again, a generation before, but it might as well have been 100 years before, with the money, with the attractions, with the women and the cars, and the sharks are circling, and these guys pretty much don't have any sort of protection that you could possibly have.
That's exactly right. I think you're quite right that I think Pelé's era was just a different era. And when you're comparing these players and you're comparing Pelé and Maradona, and then now we talk about Messi and maybe Cristiano Ronaldo, I think, the era that Diego existed in terms of the rise of football, the fame of these players, the money involved, the global fame involved, but at the same time, the lack of professionalism, the lack of safeguarding, the only thing I would say is also the lack of social media, which, is a big thing now and they didn't have to deal with then, but they still had the press and they still had this global fame, and this money and all these temptations. And I think he was really at that sort of perfect moment of all of those things coming together to make it almost an impossible crucible. And if you were a flawed character as he was, those temptations were perhaps too great for him. And so, yes, he's in Barcelona, and there is money, and there are women, and there's drink, and there's drugs, and there's also football. But he's also an outsider. He was never really welcomed into the city or into the club. Really fully taken to heart. He was viewed as being this sudaca, this kind of dirty South American, import. So he surrounded himself with his friends from back home, and he insulated himself. And it was not like it was later in Napoli.
Yeah, but why Napoli? Because if you think, again, 80s, you're thinking of AC Milan. You're thinking of, Ruud van Gullit. You're thinking of Van Nistelrooy, Ruud Gullit, Van Nistelrooy. All these great players who are playing in the north, basically. Italy is two countries, the north and the south, and Napoli is well, actually, there's three countries. You've got Napoli as well. It is chaotic. It isn't a football superpower. And it's not Roma. It's not Lazio. It's Napoli. How do they make this approach? And is there skullduggery going on, David, to attract him here?
I think I'm not sure there's skullduggery in attracting him. I think there might have been a bit in eventually paying for him. I think the attraction actually was quite visceral for him and was quite a sort of simple sell in a way. I think he did always see himself as, he never grew out of being the boy from the Potrero and the boy who had this poor background and was a champion really for some of the poor and some of the marginalized and less represented. And so I think he embraced that about Napoli. Certainly once he was there, he wholeheartedly embraced that and kind of went to war really with the North over how they treated the Southerners and the people of Naples, and how they made songs and chants about them and insulted them and so on. So I think emotionally, and he was guided a lot by his gut and by his emotion, and he wanted to play for Boca because it was his dad's team, and he could have gone to River Plate and he didn't want to because politically, emotionally, everything else, they weren't what he stood for. And I think Napoli was a really good fit in that way for him. But also it benefited certain people in Naples to have a superstar player like him arrive. It benefited the Camorra and the Giuliano clan in Naples, who controlled the grey market around football, who controlled the kind of touting, the on-street gambling networks, the merchandise kind of, fake merchandising and all the kind of bootleg stuff that was going on, was all money in their pockets. And so having a superstar and having perhaps increased success on the pitch was only going to benefit them. So, yeah, Napoli were a team who had never won anything of note. They'd never won the title. They'd never won the main Coppa Italia. And so in that sense, it does seem strange, but on a kind of emotional, visceral, spiritual level, it seemed like home, I think, to him. There's a strong link between Naples and the south of Italy and Argentina. A lot of immigration occurred. A lot of the people he grew up with and around would have had their roots in Naples and in southern Italy. So I think he felt this affection. They pitched it to him perfectly, I think, as that, the chance to be a champion for this city, these people. And on the pitch, and in terms of that, I mean, it was absolute gangbusters, brought them their first title as part of a double, winning the cup at the same time, won their first European trophy, the UEFA Cup, then backed it up with a second Scudetto, a second league title. So this is kind of unprecedented success for a team from the south and for Napoli. But all the good things about being in Napoli kind of gradually turned sour and became the bad things. The patronage of the Camorra, the oppressive love of the people, the goldfish bowl of life there as a footballing god just became too much. And by the end, he was being kind of kept there almost against his will by Fellaino, the chairman of the club. And he was just desperate to get out, even though he'd had all this success and had all this love.
And how's his personal life then going? I mean, he's surrounded by yes people. I mean, when I saw those pictures of him in Russia, it was just like, I can see what's happening here. He's just, people go, it's like buying Oliver Reed a drink. It's like, doing the same with, come on, mate, private jet. But he's married. He's got he's got kids. Are they back in Argentina? Are they away from? I mean, is he doing the patriarch, the South American patriarch thing, and everybody else is back in Argentina, and he's having the time of his proverbial life in Europe?
He takes people with him. He normally has his parents very close to him. He has his wife and his kids with him, but he sort of becomes increasingly absent. He's still out all the time, as he has been since he was a teenager, dating his by then wife. But initially they're teenage sweethearts. They are neighbors. She was the girl next door when he moved in Buenos Aires when he got his first apartment. So he ends up, they don't get married for a long, long time. They have children prior to getting married. She is fiercely loyal to him. He promises her on more than one occasion that he hasn't been cheating and hasn't had illegitimate children. There's, this big scandal that breaks around Mexico '86 with Cristiana Sinagra, who he eventually kind of is no longer able to deny he had a relationship with and is the father of her child. So his behavior becomes increasingly difficult to control, and increasingly the people around him, as you say, perhaps aren't really trying to control it anymore, and are just trying to facilitate it perhaps in the way that best benefits them. And he was hard to control, and I accept that, and I'm not sure what the solution ever is to that. And I think that is something that you mentioned, Senna, for example. I think the story that perhaps interested Asif Kapadia, the documentary maker who made Diego Maradona, made the Senna documentary, also made Amy, the Amy Winehouse film. If you look at those characters, it's about the price of fame. It's about being an idol. It's about what we do to our idols, our sporting and musical and pop culture kind of gods and icons, and the kind of price of that fame. And like you say, sometimes the price of that fame is that these people are put up on a pedestal and then they are torn down, and that it's impossible for them to navigate their own life and for anybody to help them do that, because they get to such a point where, as you say, you can only be surrounded by yes men, and it's very difficult to say no to these people. And if you say no to them, you don't get to hang around much longer. So I think his life became increasingly difficult to manage, and it did have this kind of tragic inevitability. Perhaps one of the people around him, his family did their best for him. His parents maybe weren't the kind of characters to be able to do much for him, to steer his career, his finances, anything like that. I think his agents did their best. Certainly Sita Spieler did his best, but in the end was a self-taught man and kind of wasn't quite up to what became the modern world of football management. Perhaps his trainer was perhaps his most loyal supporter and aide, Signorini, who helped him get clean and get fit for every World Cup, and was the one person who kind of took him out into the countryside, got him to sweat it all out cold turkey, got him fit, and did his best to look after him. But it was difficult. And these personalities, when you reach that level, when you're meeting popes and you're getting private tours of Red Square and people are taking vials of your blood and starting shrines in churches, in your honor, it's hard to keep perspective when you're that person. And it's very hard to help and control that person in a positive way if you're around them, I think.
I mean, did Napoli want him to go, or they just got bored with him now? Yeah, he's too much of a liability. He's past his sell-by date. I mean, when did Napoli let him go, as it were?
I think towards the end, by the time he had started this kind of war in the press between the North and the South and Italy and Argentina during World Cup Italia '90,
didn't he say that Naples should support Argentina because
He knew how loved he was in Naples. He knew how much Naples hated the North and the North hated Naples. And he got slightly tricked or goaded or just allowed himself to wade into this very publicly. And yes, he tried to encourage the people of the South and the people of Naples to support Argentina over Italy. And I think that was just a misstep, just a misjudgment. I think he was loved, but in the end, they were still Italian. They were still patriotic. There were some who backed Maradona. There were some fans who, you know, supported other national sides because of the Dutch influence in Milan or so on. But I think he misjudged it. He got booed. He mouthed, you know, obscenities under his breath when the camera panned across him, very deliberately, I think, to say, you know, forget these guys, we're going to do it anyway. But he didn't. He lost in the final, albeit they did knock out Italy, obviously, controversially. So I think, yeah, he knocked out Italy. He started this war. He was unhappy. He was rebelling against Fellaino. He thought he'd been promised that he could leave, and Fellaino said, no, you're staying. We need to win another tournament, you know, another trophy. He increasingly didn't want to come back to Italy from Argentina. He started, you know, maneuvering to try and get a move, making it known in the press that he wanted to leave. Even considered going back to Barcelona, which is crazy given what happened there. That's the extent to how unhappy he was, I think, that he even thought maybe I could go back to Barcelona, you know, with the place where he left because he was, you know, pulling kung fu kicks in the cup final in front of the King of Spain. So it did all go wrong, and he lost that support. You know, he had this patronage, he had this support. The club supported him. The club was powerful. The club, you know, had journalists that would help them. And then he had the support and the patronage of the Camorra, who were obviously incredibly powerful. And when those two organizations started to see that the risks were starting to outweigh the rewards, he was starting to bring heat from the authorities. He was getting caught up in criminal investigations. The Operation China ended up leading to his prosecution in Italy. So as they saw the writing on the wall, I think they did not only distance themselves from him, but sort of actively started to operate against him, I think. And then the writing really was on the wall.
And then we get 94, and I remember watching it. It's, you know, again, it's the year that Senna's died. Brazil unfurled, of course, this banner in the final. I dissolved into tears at that point. But the way that he looked into that camera, and then he is killed by the media, and they're like, oh, well, we told you so. And, you know, we're all human beings, and we've only got 2 minutes, I'm afraid, David. But, you know, if you were going to push a man over the edge, this is kind of what you're taking away, the thing that the only thing that he understands, really.
Yeah, he lived for football, and that crushed him. And in his eyes, he hadn't cheated. He wasn't on cocaine. The Scream was not his cocaine, mania coming out. The book is partly to explain, actually, maybe that Scream was all these things that had led up to that. But ultimately, he gets drugs tested. He's taken this supplement, the wrong supplement that has the wrong dosage of things that are on FIFA's banned list, but are legal over the counter as part of bodybuilding supplements and so on in the US. But they throw the book at him, as they often do with Maradona. He gets treated very, very harshly. In order to save Argentina, he is punished as harshly as they can do so. And he's lost without football. And that's part of the tragedy of his story. And I think he was an amazing footballer, but his story is such a roller coaster. And so, yes, I hope people will read the book and get maybe a new insight into him as a human being, and to what he managed to achieve on the pitch. Those glorious goals and all those trophies, and that joyful football that he expressed on the pitch, despite all this darkness that was swirling around him. Not just his internal demons, but all these actors around him pulling his strings and manipulating him with and without his understanding.
The book is called Killing Maradona. It's by David Arrowsmith, who we're speaking to today. David, people want to follow you online. Where's the best place to find you?
I'm on most social media, David Arrowsmith, author. I'm having some issues, as I'm sure some others have done recently, with X, formerly Twitter. So I would say go on Insta, anywhere else, David Arrowsmith, author. I've got a Facebook page. Track me down, say hi. If you like the book, let me know. Thanks for listening, everybody. And you can buy the book by our own virtual bookstore. The book is called Killing Maradona. It's by David Arrowsmith. David, once again, thank you so much for your time today.